Madam Speaker, 400 years ago, as we've heard tonight, the first slave ship arrived in Virginia. This began one of the darkest chapters in American history. During the course of over 250 years of slavery, that's government-sanctioned slavery in America, families were ripped apart, people were beaten and brutalized, men, women, and children were sold and traded like objects. And to this day, Black communities continue to suffer from the generational trauma from these crimes against humanity. And that was followed by another 75 years of racism and domestic terrorism under Jim Crow and segregation, which thousands of African Americans were lynched. Churches were bombed. Entire communities were burned to the ground in the not-so-recent distant past. And racist economic policies also institutionalized the racial hierarchy established by slavery and kept African Americans trapped and segregated disproportionately in poverty. Policies like land seizure laws that left African American farmers at risk of having their land seized and turned over to their white peers, to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which excluded professions dominated by African Americans from minimum wage protections, to the separate but equal doctrine in school and public facilities, to the segregation of the armed services, in which my dad served in a segregated military, fighting in 2 wars for our country. Jim Crow gave way to decades of racist housing policies like redlining and subprime lending that further prevented African Americans from building wealth, followed by the war on drugs, which devastated our communities, tore apart families, and incarcerated millions of needlessly incarcerated fellow African Americans. Today, we see continued disparities among African Americans due to the legacy of slavery, racism, and Jim Crow in America. African Americans still face disproportionate levels of poverty, unemployment, and overwhelming struggles to achieve educational and economic opportunities. Health disparities, including the highest rate of HIV infections, continue to impact African American communities due to the lack of equal access and prevention resources. It's completely unacceptable that Black women are 4 times more likely to die from preventable pregnancy complications than white women. Now, for decades, our criminal justice system has disproportionately targeted communities of color, especially Black and brown women and men. Structural and institutional racism permeates every aspect of American society. And now, sadly, we have a presidential administration that continues to ignore our nation's dark history of racism and bondage, and in many ways is trying to move us backwards from voter suppression, from targeting African Americans and people of color, with budget cuts, that undermine and affect their livelihoods, to undermining decades of civil rights. The gains that we've made, now we see an administration that is trying to roll those protections back. This president is trying to turn back the clock. Tragically, we are also now seeing history repeat itself with rampant family separation of immigrant families at the border, children being taken from their parents and put into cages. The president has normalized racism and xenophobia. His constant attacks on African Americans and people of color, to questioning the nationality of our first Black president, to claiming that they are good people among white supremacists. His racism has given others permission to hate out loud. It has also set the stage for the toxic mix of racism, gun violence, and domestic terrorism that is gripping our country. Yes, we have a president today and an administration who continues to fan the flames of the fire that was born out of slavery. So let me be clear, though, we aren't going back. As our beloved Dr. Maya Angelou once said, and still we rise. And just because we aren't going back doesn't mean we shouldn't look back and learn from our past. That informs what we must do today. Now, the Akan people of West Africa, they have a mythical symbol. It's a mythical bird It's a bird called Sankofa. The bird looks back with an egg in her mouth. It means reminding us to look back at our past, to look at the mistakes we made, to look at what happened in our past that has strengthened us and made us who we are today, and to move forward and to not make those same mistakes, but to fly forward, creating a new world based on justice and freedom. This is our Sankofa moment. Earlier this month, we observed the 400th anniversary by traveling to Ghana with a delegation of members led by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Congresswoman Karen Bass. It was such a privilege and an honor to witness and hear our speaker speak as the first American speaker of the United States of America to the Ghanaian Parliament. This strengthened the ties that binds not only between Africans and African Americans, but between the African continent and American continent. People in both of our continents really have a long history that we need to recognize as being oftentimes very, very difficult, but together we must move forward. And so while we were there, we paid our respects at Cape Coast and Elmina Castles. And at the door of no return, we walked through, where the first enslaved Africans departed in chains, enslaved for America. The experience was a powerful reminder of the inhumanity of the slave trade. But it was also empowering to witness the strength and determination of the enslaved to survive and to build a better future for the next generation. And we walked back through the door of return. What a glorious moment that was for all of us. So today, as we observe 400 years since the first Africans were brought to these shores, let it be known that this is a Sankofa moment. Moving forward, I look forward to this body addressing the damage caused by the inhumanity of slavery by advancing positive legislation that uplifts the descendants of those who were enslaved, including H.R. 40, championed by our great warrior woman, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, whose steadfast and brilliant work is educating the Congress and the public as to why a commission to look at these past inequities, bring them current, and how we begin to address them in 2019. Let me close by reading a quote from Nicole Hannah-Jones. She's the author of the 1619 Project. The project aims to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding and placing the consequences of slavery and contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story. We tell ourselves about who we are. In her seminal piece in the New York Times, Hannah-Jones wrote, "Our Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4th, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. But the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of Black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not apply fully to 1/5 of the country. Yet despite being violently denied the freedom and justice promised to all, Black Americans believed fervently in the American creed. Through centuries of Black resistance and protest, we have helped the country to live up to its founding ideals." She said, "Without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic, mind you, patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy today would most likely look very different. It might not be a democracy at all." Madam Speaker, I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert the New York Times Magazine 1619